Hey guys, this is Chris from Deus Ex Machina, and I am showing off our newest product. Not a terribly complicated, it's not a big budget project. This is basically a an amalgam of a lot of stuff we've done with a bunch of new content. I am talking about Oktober's Arcane Almanac. This started off as a relatively small project where I was compiling all the different spellcasting systems that I've created over the last few years into one book. And then I decided to add one, which became two, and then eventually three. So it has four or five rule systems you may be aware of, and three new ones. For those people who aren't aware, October is a character created by Mark Meir, and him and I are friends, and him and I have kind of collaborated in the past. And as you can see, we like including his visage in our illustrations. And there he is here, and there he is there. Both illustrations are by Nick Greenwood, who does all the illustrations in this book. So we are going to go through this book. I'm going to show off the things that we're offering. And once again, if you've purchased everything that we've made, then much of this will be familiar. Some of it will be brand spanking new. If you haven't acquired anything from us before, or only maybe purchased Ultramodern 5, then a lot of this will appear as new. But we have a bunch of different spellcasting systems from different genres, each one trying to play with some new mechanics, trying to break away from the assumptions. Some of them do involve some of the common tropes with a D&D spellcasting. Some of the spells will become very familiar, but each one tries to do something very different. I don't believe that there is anything here that's going to seem mechanically identical to the Vantian system that D&D has been embracing since the 80s. This is the cover. Here's the contents. We won't obviously dwell on those too much. Every once in a while, of course, I will pick up little mistakes that I have to go in and fix, like the contents has to go in there and fix that. But this is not the final. This is close to final. We're pretty close to final, but this is what we're going to be saying. We have an introduction that's written from October's point of view, and we're going to go into the different systems. We have the Dark System, which comes from Ultramodern. Cryption, which is from the Paradise book in the Affinity trilogy. The Maker, which is from Conestoga. Smoke, which is from Taurus. Sprout, which recently got released in Amethyst Revelations. And then the three new ones, the Veil, the Trigger, and the Eldritch. Oh, then a little bit of a mistake there I got to fix. That should be over there. Okay, so suffice to say, this was a lot more work than I was expecting. The Eldritch system, for example, took way longer. The Trigger and the Veil weren't terribly complicated, but the Eldritch took like 3 weeks. This was supposed to get released in early to mid-November. It's now December. Thankfully, it should be ready to come out this week digitally. Will there be a physical release? Not as of yet, but it's something I'm going to approach. It'll depend entirely on how popular this book is. If there's a lot of demand for a physical release, I may do a Kickstarter for that, just so we can get it to a level where I'm happy with it as a physical release. We may still do as a print-on-demand function. I would prefer to have it out digitally, a print-on-demand option, not function. I prefer to have it out for a couple months and to get fan feedback and see if there's anything technically we needed to close up. And instead of putting out an errata, just updating the digital release, and I'll do that before we do a physical release to make sure that people have a physical product that's up to date. Skills and proficiencies, these are carried over from Ultramodern 5. I'm trying to make this book divorced from Ultramodern 5. So even though it has a lot of stuff from Ultramodern 5, those rules are replicated here. Not too many, just a couple pages. We go into the Dark System. Once again, this is a slightly updated version of the one that's found in Dark. Most of the updates are just basically balancing issues. But if you have the newest version of Ultramodern, it should be identical. It won't look the same because we're using different fonts, but beyond that, for those people who don't know, the Dark System plays off of, once again, every single time I'm going to talk about this, we'll talk about the new mechanics with Dark. We actually have a new ability score. It's the only one that does that. It's called Vigor. It has skills attached to it: Commune, Detection, and Induce. That's a mistake. I have to get that. Should be like that, so I'll get that noted. Among many things, it has resources. You actually have a resource which is called a vessel, and Dark is a resource that you use up. There's actually another system. I think the Trigger system uses a resource as well. The idea that the resource drains, but over a period of time, it eventually replenishes. The difference between this and Trigger, the Trigger system replenishes. No, sorry, the Veil system. is what has the resource. It replenishes very, very quickly. This one replenishes a lot slower. You may think of it, you regain 1 loss point for your vessel at the start of your turn. As you use a bonus action, you regain 2 loss points. Use an action, you regain a number of points. And yet, the trigger system actually regenerates, the veil system regenerates faster than dark, but they're very, very similar. The difference, of course, is spellcasting itself. You basically purchase spells, and as you purchase spells in a specific family of spells, kind of like schools, they're called paths, you get to purchase more. This is actually a bit different because it's a very techno-magic system. So we have a lot of techno-magic weapons, armor, and equipment. For example, you can have an additional limb that'll do the somatic components, for example. That's a little thing that we are displaying with this really wonderful illustration. You can have dark as an actual physical resource, like it's actually in a tank that you can carry. You can have cybernetics that will help you. You can draw sigils with lasers and so forth. So there's a lot of techno-magic. That's the only one that's heavily techno-magic. And as a result, there's a huge section on the gear that you can use. It's the only section that does it. We get into, there is a life path, which is the only chapter that includes some life path options. If I were to do this on Kickstarter and it would fund, if I were doing modifications, I would probably add life paths to each one. But I think Dark is the only one with it. Magus is the class. We go into detail here. And then there's not much because it's all in the spellcasting section. We have a couple archetypes, which I don't believe, I can't remember whether or not I added. Yeah, I think these are all new. I don't believe I added archetypes in Dark, so this is new. So I don't believe there are archetypes for the Dark casters in Ultramodern 5. We have some feats and then the spell list, and this will look very similar. People will have Dark. Have Ultramodern 5. You pick a path, and when you pick a path, you get a kind of a static ability. We can see here. Where is it? Here's an example here. Yeah. So there's traits. Attack, gives you an additional trait. There's a synergy, which makes it easier to get skills in another one. So every path has a synergy path. So the path of attraction and the path of knowledge are similar. You gain a path benefit. You gain proficiency in one charisma skill of your choice. That's the path of attraction. Then you can see the skills. When you pick up one, you pick up the root spells. And then every time you pick up, you can scale up to tiers. And eventually you get to much more powerful ones here. This one here has the casting cost. I think this is the cost to buy the spell, because you have to purchase spells as you level up. And then that's the cost in Dark to cast it. That's the time it costs, that's the range, and then duration, and then the components. Vocal, somatic, and then sometimes they have material components as well. This is not too dissimilar. If you know anything about Dungeon & Dragon spell casting, that's pretty standard. So the spells are all here. Once again, unlike the Fantasy system, which has hundreds and hundreds of spells, because all the spellcasters work basically the same. They all run off of spell levels, and so the same spells for the bard are the same the sorcerer and the wizard use. I don't know if there's a spell that every spellcaster uses, but there probably is. But the point is there's a lot of common spells. We don't do it that way. So every chapter is self-contained. You don't have to refer to another a chapter, every single, which means in some cases some of the spell effects are thematically duplicated. I tried to make them different, but there's just no way around it. You'll always have a sleep spell, you'll always have a charm spell. Sometimes they play a little differently and sometimes they don't. That's just how it is. So there's a lot of these paths. There's actually quite a few. Decay, Earth, Flame, Illusion, Life and Light, Movement, Might, Power, and it ends with Water, which is the last one. And then those are the water spells. There's only one tier for a water spell, but some of them it's one tier, and this one here, tier 3's got 3 spells. But the idea is that you cast a spell using the casting cost. If it doesn't have a casting cost, you notice here it has a little star because that is a ritual. And rituals operate a little differently than regular spells, because these are basically, it's a casting cost. It's something because it basically defines it as a combat spell. So in certain situations, as you can see here, this one's mostly rituals, but we go over to here. There's a handful of rituals and a lot of combat spells. Path of Protection, for example, the majority of them are combat spells. Path of Power, no rituals. So they're all a little different. So I'll skip past this one, going to the next one. The Maker comes from Conestoga. It tries to be more of a psionic class where there aren't spells per se. It's much more combat, much more dynamic. Maybe not as many options, but it has its own way of creating something unique, and I'll go into that. There's a ladder. We talked about ladders a bit in Ultramodern. These are basically themed feats that go together. So you get one if you choose the ladder at first level, and then you have 5 additional feats that get increasingly more powerful. With the Metron, which is the ladder, you get random psionic abilities, which is kind of unique. So this is all based around the ladder. The Maker is the class. The Maker, once again, is an elemental psionic class. It's one of the most unique ones you'll see in this book because it doesn't, you see powers, but it uses a sphere grid or a tree, which is very common in video games. Maybe Path of Exile. This one was inspired by, it was called Outriders. That was the game. It was heavily, influential in this class. So the idea is that you start here, and every time you level, you get to move up along this path. And as you can see, you have to follow a chain. So if you go here, you can't choose this one. You have to kind of follow the path. Although sometimes they link. So you can go this way, this way, this way. You can get this one. And you'll notice there are a few things that are a little different. For example, the ability score modifiers are in here. So you actually have to go in, which means you can't technically avoid them and go past it. And means that technically you could waste time and go into this one and go into this one, but that means you're not moving up. And these get more powerful as you scale up. And if you go into here, and then to here, and to here, and then to there, you probably won't get to the big ones. And you can see there are some really big ones. Like literally there's a raised dead effect at the top of this one. This is the Geospoiler. This is the earth-based magic. So it's earth and necromancy. There's basically 2 types of elements. So thunder, stone, protection, basically shielding yourself. That's in this one. And once again, the necromancy section's in here as well. So this is all necromancy stuff. Healing, vampiric grasp, that's all in here. There's basically 3 branches. So that's necromancy. This branch is all about thunder and thunder damage. And then this one's all about defense. It's about basically basically using the earth to make yourself more powerful, and it's a bit more abstract. Like this one's very clearly thunder and thunder-based spells. This is very much necrotic, but this one's a bit more like it says ignore terrain, stone stride. You can create spike traps and so forth. And then at one point you can actually encase yourself in stone armor at one point. So these may seem like spells, but they don't operate like spells. For example, here, most of these take an action or a bonus action, so they're very, very quick. Duration 1 round. But then we see this, which is a recharge. Every single, when you pick up a power, and you don't get a lot of powers, you only get a handful of these things. So you don't have to worry about all of them. You have it used to be a timer. It used to count down. Then I realized that didn't work as a mechanic because gameplay runs faster than most of these timers. So instead, you roll randomly. You roll a d4, and you have to get over a certain value, which is 6 up. Now you're saying right off the bat, well, that can never happen. You'll never roll a 6 up on a die 4. Well, every round where you don't get this regeneration, this number goes up. You can also have abilities that will increase the die on certain spells. So, for example, you can get Decay Touch up to a die 8, which means you could potentially cast it repeatedly depending on if you're lucky. Most of them are like that, 7+ on a d4, 9+ on a d4, which makes it's harder for this thing to reset. You have to spend resources upgrading this dice and potentially increasing other modifiers. And this is all in your and some of your other abilities you have here, your combat powers and so forth. You gain the ability, and we'll see right here. You can see what I mean. I'll give an example here. Improved heal, endure necrotic, and some of these, like recharge necrotic, for example. These are the tree steps, and you can see them here. This damage increases to 3 die 6. You gain resistance, extends range, Where is the one I'm thinking of here? So here it is. Recharge Earth Necrotic Thunder. Increase the recharge die of all your Earth Necrotic or Thunder powers by 1 step. D4 to D6 to D8 to D10 to D12. So this is basically what you can do to increase the recharge capacity of your abilities. So it's very much you're in combat, you're basically involved in combat, and you're cooking these abilities off. And that's basically how it works. There's nothing permanent. There's no ritual magic, unlike the dark system. This is a combat caster. You're only throwing things out. You'll notice, like, at best, you have 1 minute spells with duration, and that's about it. Most of them are combat spells. And that's just how it is. But the thing is, that's not the only one. There's actually 4 of these. You can almost actually say that the maker is 4 classes, but you can actually respec, which means at certain levels you can erase your character and rebuild it and go in different paths, which is something you can do canonically. You don't have to multi-class. You can pick up a path in Geospoiler and pick up abilities in Hydromancer. You won't be able to maximize it in every path, but if you want to get some Hydromancer and some Geospoiler powers, you can. And this one, same thing. We have Blight, so this is poison. We have Acid on the right, and then some general water effects in the center, right? This allows you, like, swimming and create, it's almost like like a water bender. You're creating water tentacles and water whips and stuff like that. So that's the Hydromancer. And we go into, again, it's still not over. We still have the Tempest, which is the air, lightning. We have pushing and kinesis, like basically kinetic punch. This is basically force effects. So that is lightning damage, this is force damage, and then this is more general air effects. That's why you have flight in here. And this is, of course, a techno class as well in a way. A lot of the abilities actually work with firearms, because this is a class that assumes that this is a sci-fi or modern setting, because you can actually imbue your bullets like this. All acid, all poison are some examples of that. And that's still not over, because we have the thermal, which is fire. But of course, it's not just fire, it's thermal. It's cold and fire. So fire is on the left, cold is on the right, and then radiant is in the center. So this is a much more aggressive combat class. Unlike the Geospoiler, which has some defense abilities, this has very little of that. It's all about frontal assault. And once again, you notice some really wonderful illustrations. But that's how this class works. It is a tree system. As a result, that's another reason why the class seems very simplistic, right? You look at the class, you have the combat powers and tiers, but you notice that there's nothing here listing they have an archetype feature, right? You can choose an archetype if you want, but there are no archetypes listed for the maker. There are no maker specific archetypes. I may actually just delete that, just because it is such an unusual class. It may not be compatible with archetypes, so I may delete that. I probably will. So we're going to go past that into the next one. There isn't anything additional on that. We'll go into Cryption. This is the closest one to a traditional magic, to a Vancian spellcasting system. It does do a couple of things interesting. One, the entire spellcasting system is based on writing glyphs on pieces of paper and then using that to imbue power. So they're, unlike the previous one, this one is much more about wards, about laying down area effects and enchanting people, positive or negative. There are not a lot, like there's no fireball, there's no lightning bolt. You have to be able to apply a piece of paper onto something or someone for this to have an effect. But there's lots of them. But these are more traditional spells because there's a pretty large spell list. The weird thing is that you basically have to, the balancing system is money, which it's going to be a little weird. So I'm going to say, are you telling me a billionaire could be unstoppable? Theoretically, yes. But money has always been a mechanically balanced system in D&D. That's why you don't give first level characters 100,000 gold. It would break the game. And the same thing applies with this. So there are spells that cost more than others. So every spell has a cost. Even the basic cryptions, most of them don't cost that much. 5 silver pieces, 5 silver pieces, 5 silver pieces. Some of the more expensive ones can get up there in price. And then you basically find and acquire these spells. And like, once again, even though we don't have spell levels, like you don't pick spell levels, you can just pick. The way that but you do have a level you can cast at. So you can't grab a 9th level cryption at first level. You have to get to 17th level before you can write 9th level cryptions. But once you have them, if you have the money, you can cast them however you want, whatever you want. There's a little lore bit that the actual word you write down is listed underneath it. There's quite a few, not as many once again as D&D for the same reasons, but we can see going up higher what some of these cost. Like True Polymorph is 100 gold piece spell, so you have to be careful. But you notice that that's the only spell cost. Like you don't have to buy like Eye of Newt or what have you. It's simply the cost of the writing components, the expense of the ink, the expense of the paper. This is how much it costs you to cast that spell. The other big mechanic with this system is that you can charm people by placing the pieces of paper on them. That's how you charm them. You can buff someone by doing the same thing. But this moves into branding. In some situations, these words can be burned into your skin, and this actually creates permanent buffs. But that brand also has a sacrifice. So for Colossus of Pixis, for example, you suffer -1 to initiative, but you gain a +1 bonus to AC. And then there are rules of how many of these you can add and so forth. They're all right here. There's actually quite a few. There's a whole bunch. And because this is also relating to alchemy, because you can add these pieces of paper as labels onto potions, we have potion rules as well. Something that's also very unique to the Cryption class. It's the only one that has the alchemy. I was thinking of separating these as their own chapter, having a chapter just for brands and just for alchemy. But I wanted, because it's related to the Cryption system, they all fall into one chapter. So there's a similar system that found itself in Amethyst Revelations, but that doesn't get replicated here. This was originally written for Paradise, but that's that system there. And right after that, we should be moving into. You can also make golems. The idea of putting a word on a piece of paper and attaching it to a inanimate object and it gaining life. Well, that's in classic human mythology. That goes back thousands of years. In fact, that's the origin of Golem. For those people who want to dive into Judaism and where these originally came from with Emmet and Haim and so forth, that's how Golems came about. This is a much more expanded version where you can make basically a bunch of different types of golems. It gives you the time and then the cost modifier. So we have brass, bronze, clay, sand, flesh, copper, chromium, all the way to wood. So this is not about making 3 golems that are in Monster Manual. This is about making bespoke golem creations. And you can enhance them. You can make them look human with glamour. You can make them stronger or weaker, or maybe you can give them better eyes. And we have rules on all the expansions you can give them. And then we have examples on these golems: a brass bugbear, a clay dragon, a copper owl bear. In this one here, the tin demon, the wood giant. Because you basically can take any monster from any 5e book and turn it into a golem using these rules. So that leads us into Smoke, which is the closest thing to a steampunk one. It's techno-magic like Dark. It plays on a much more steampunk rather than a cyberpunk, which was what Dark was doing. I'm not going to be able to speak after this. The Oxomancer uses Smoke. That's the play on steampunk smoke. But this unique mechanic is that you actually use a physical deck of cards. And I'm not joking. You actually use a physical deck of cards. You grab the aces, the 2s and 3s. That's your starting deck. And as you level up, you can add higher levels, like 3s and 4s and 5s. Eventually, you can add in some of the face cards. And then there are rules, and this allows you to do stuff like that. You can select your favorite suit between club, diamond, heart, or spades. Here are all the unique abilities that the face cards give you, which are the kickers. So the Jack of Hearts, if you draw the Jack of Hearts, that gives you a very specific ability. But the idea is this is chaos magic. You draw a card, and that tells you how much power you have to cast that spell, which means once we get to the spells, once again, they're broken up into levels. We call them tiers. So not too dissimilar to what we see with Vancian, but without the way they do their spell casting. You have a spell, you can pick, you'll say Shockwave, and then the power of the card you've cast will tell you whether or not you can cast it. Obviously, if it's one, for example, Aether Beam, the power level of the card. So if you put out a 2 of hearts, it's going to be 3d8 with a +1 modifier to the attack roll. If you draw out a 10 of spades, it's going to be 12d8 and a +9 attack modifier. So pretty easy how that kind of stuff works. Now, some of us will say, well, there's no 1 of diamonds. I know, but there is an ace, and the ace can operate as a 1, but it has some other benefits that are unique to it. And there are other rules as well. And of course, once you run out of cards, that's it. You got to regenerate your deck, and there are ways to regenerate your deck. And there's a lot of rules to go into that. We also play off of the mechanics, like mechanical devices. There are devices that you can create, that you can kind of program your spells to work with. They're called analogs. Some of the, like these are hex spells that don't require analogs. When we get to the later ones, we'll see how much it costs to build an analog, and some of them will actually see that they require an analog to be cast, which means you actually have to build or buy the analog to be able to cast that spell. And that's more of a mechanical, like more of a flavor text. Rather, it's not going to really be. It's not like the spell cost system in the Cryption system, where you have to spend that money each time you cast a spell. Once you buy the analog for augury, you don't have to spend that kind of money. You just have that device. And then there are rules to be able to implant these devices into your armor, into weapons, and so forth, so they're always not taking up a hand. There's some rules for that. You can build a homunculi, and there are rules for that. And so, but that's the Oxymancer. It's a deck building chaos magic system. This has been tested pretty well. I think it's a pretty good system. But once again, it's a unique. I like the idea of playing off of board game mechanics, and obviously this was one. We do bag building with the civilian in Ultramodern 5, and I'd like to find more board game mechanics that I can play with and insert into D&D to have some fun. So yeah, if you like deck building, then the Oxymancer might be an interesting course. Once again, it's compatible with steampunk settings. It's not mandatory, but it is an aspect of the setting. Which brings us to the next one. This is the Sprout system, which is from Amethyst Revelations. This is probably the most technically complex system because it's not about you casting spells. It's about you creating living spells. That it's almost like you're creating an elemental. Like you're not creating a fireball. You're creating a fire elemental that will then work on your behalf. So it allows you to do other things while your elemental is doing other things. And then you can imbue that elemental with other abilities. So you're not creating a fireball, you're creating a fire elemental that can potentially blow up as a fireball or do fire arrows or turn into a fire trap. You can imbue with all these abilities. There's also a much weaker one called a Wisp, and the Wisp allows you to create the enchantments. This Wisp flies around, it can fly into people's heads and charm them and what have you. It's a bit more classic spellcasting. You actually, you have a totem, which is a Bookworn Orb, which is very much played off of Amethyst. And then we have a bunch of archetypes. There's actually more archetypes with this one than on any other ones. So this section here allows you to custom build, because basically that's how it works. You don't build it on the fly. You actually have to build this before you cast it. So before the game session begins, when you're at home, before you go to a game session or after you go to a game session, you will construct your spells, right? You have a certain amount of resources to work with where you can build air, and then you can add additional else to it. So, for example, you can add water and then add acid to that water. There's compatibility. It tells you which ones are compatible to which. Tells you right there which ones are incompatible. And then you can even add additional ones. So you could have a water acid radiant. Oh, you couldn't. It says it's incompatible. Never mind. So you'd have to pick with necrotic. There you go. You could do a water thunder. Oh, sorry, water poison necrotic elemental. You don't have to do that because that just costs additional resources. You may want to spend in other formats. There are some modifiers to creating the monster, because this is a monster. It's not just a spell that you can't target. It is a living creature. And we go into some examples of some stats. Like this tells you the stats and how to create it. This is basically an elemental monster creation system. And then you can spend resources to give it a higher proficiency bonus, give it immunities, give it better senses, give it better hit dice, all of that. This is all completely custom. Depending on your element, you get additional abilities, right? Like acid gets you caustic. And then there are optional actions you can do. Like, for example, you can see blood drain is when you can get to blood. You got to purchase them. The cost, the kind of totem cost. Like if you want to add life drain to necrotic, it costs 2, and we can see what the totem costs for these things. So 3 plus 2 if you want to add it. So this is a plus 2. So if you wanted a water, you can have a water earth one. It would be 3 plus 2 is 5. Add acid, that added to 7. And then if you wanted to add some of these abilities, it gets up there. And of course, once this creature gets destroyed, you don't get those resources back. So don't spend all your totem cost all in one creature, because you may expend yourself and not be able to create something. So most likely you will have not just one spell that you're going to cast all the time. You'll have 3 or 4 different variations that you've built. Same thing with the wisps, which are very basic. We actually have some examples right here. Here's a magma arcanum and an air arcanum. And they're very different creatures. And you can do that. And the wisp, of course, is very weak, but it's designed to convey more enchantment abilities, but they're very inexpensive. Here are all the ingrafts. Now, ingrafts are thinking, oh, these are the spells. These are the abilities you can imbue in your living creatures. Some of them you'll notice say wisp only. So these only apply to the wisps. These are universal. They apply to every type. And then we have ones that are specifically tied to elements. So acid only, air only, blood only, fire only, for example. And so you imbue these abilities into your living spell. So all of this is all about creating a custom, powerful elemental that you will create on the fly. And once again, you will probably have several different versions of these guys that have a different cost. And there's quite a few here, but once again, these aren't spells. You're not casting these effects. These are imbued in the elemental creation that you have created. And then we have a bunch of rituals, which are side abilities, which are a bit more traditional. And then we move on to the next one. Where are we at? 33 minutes. Probably less than that, because I'm going to be cutting some things out. The Veil system is, I've said very often that I take inspiration from board games, video games. I have said, for example, the Maker system is inspired by Outriders. If you were to play or read some of the other games I've done, there's a construction system in Conestoga, which is also in Threshold, that is effectively a copy-paste from the Dead Space series. There's some originality. I like taking ideas from video games and other formats, but I don't want to adapt something verbatim. I'm not interested in just giving someone, like, why didn't you just create? Because if you look at the way that class presented is for Maker, it's not Outriders. It's not. The way the class works is nothing like Outriders. It's the way the classes are presented are nothing like Outriders. I mean, I just took the inspiration of their elemental-based combat on the fly mechanic and to use a sphere grid, but beyond that, everything else was completely original. Their fluff isn't used. Even the way they combat, they have 3. They have kind of a ground, like they have a ground paste caster, one guy that uses acid and can create weapons out of thin air, and then the one guy that's more of a teleporter. And I center them into specific elemental roles, which Outriders doesn't do. And the same thing with the construction system I just talked about in Conestoga. I can say, yeah, it was heavily inspired. Like I said, I totally ripped off Dead Space. But if you look at it and you look at it and go, well, this is not exactly like Dead Space. I went, you're right, because when I threw it down in 5e, because I wasn't bound of doing a faithful adaptation, I was able to have fun and do some new things. There's a lot more things you can create with Conestoga than you ever could with any of the Dead Space games. Veil's another example of that. People will look at it and go, this looks like Dishonored. You'd be right, but it's not 100%. The idea of Veil, that you are basically being sponsored by an otherworldly creature, which gives you this imprint, which allows you to have these on-the-fly combat abilities. But I've played with my new lore, because I'm not beholden to Dishonored, to play off new ideas. Oddly enough, there's a video game called Drakengard, and that provided kind of that narrative offshoot. I was able to push a little bit of Drakengard in there as well, specifically the first and second games, which I've played. I never played any of the other ones. For those people who don't know, Drakengard is a very weird multiversal game. There's Drakengard 1, 2, and 3. Technically, Nier Automata are all within that same universe, or multiverse. But truthfully, I'm only talking about the original first 2 games. Specifically, the first one was the only one that really went into details on the seals and the bonding of creatures. So with here, for example, I don't have one out. They call it an outsider. Here I call it a stranger. I actually have multiple. The other thing is that they manifest as animals, which is something that which is kind of can be inspired by The Crow, for example, where you could have this animal companion, but this animal companion isn't a companion you order around. They're the ones that are actually empowering you, and you can't tell them what to do because they have a mind of their own, and they're not necessarily going to do whatever the hell it is you tell them to do because they're technically more powerful than you. The bond is for life, so they can't just take away your power. It doesn't really work that way. So it's a very interesting way of doing things. So you gain a bond, and this bond has a concord, and this concord tells you where your symbol is, so it's not always on your hand, which is where Dishonored gets their idea. And it gives you a sacrifice, similar to what we talked about with the other previous, with the branding, right? So you have a specific sacrifice, and then you get an additional benefit. For example, you can have your sigil on your left eye. You have disadvantage on ranged attack rolls beyond 30 feet and perception checks relying on vision beyond 30 feet. But you gain basically dark vision, right? You can have it on the right, and you're completely blind. But you gain the void vision twist, which operates constantly without draining aether. Void vision is kind of like blind sight. You know, you can reduce your speed by 5 feet, but you reduce all push effects by 10 feet. So you have to pick one of these, and they're all different. This is heavily inspired by the first Drakengard, where wherever your mark was, cost you, right? In the Drakengard game, the main character doesn't speak because his symbol is on his tongue. Here, I at least let you whisper. I wasn't going to make you a mute. That's in the neck. You cannot communicate verbally, but you get telepathy, a basic telepathy. So I think these are not meant to be mechanically. This is all basically, they're mechanics, but it's more fluff and character. It's where I don't think I'm really messing with you mechanically. One thing I'll also point out that these classes are presented to be compatible with the 2024 version of the Player's Handbook. And you can see here, tells you that this is similar. This is how they present it. Now this section here, proficiency, this is more similar to traditional 5e, but this is stuff. And you also notice that I mentioned stuff like the Epic Boon, which is something that's unique to 2024. You also mentioned that I'll mention weapon masteries in a couple of times, but this is still 100% compatible with 5e. The weapon mastery rules, they are literally always presented as optional, like they're not something you need to do. So going back to here, there's the actual class, the Veil Walker, and the Veil Walker, you get Aether, and Aether is constantly regenerating. But you're expected to be, this is an assassin spellcaster, so you get these kind of weaves that they're called. And then these weaves allow you to purchase things, and you can purchase either boons or you can purchase weaves, specialities. And the specialities are one-shot abilities, like no one-shot, they're permanent passive buffs. So they can either increase the damage of your assassin abilities. Once again, here's Weapon Mastery. You can pick Weapon Mastery, but only if you have that book. If you don't have that book, then you just don't pick that option. You have a whole bunch of others to choose from. And then you get into these, and then, so these are the boons. Sorry, these are non-combat abilities. These are the magical enhancements. There's two types. There's boons and there's twists. Boons are permanent magical passive abilities. For example, dark vision. Once again, we were talking about dark vision. Specific enhancements, shadow, keen, whisper, sprightliness allows you to gain movement, speed boosts, and so forth. Vitality, which just gives you more hit points. The twists, however, are your spells, but there's not a whole lot. This is all of them. There's a bunch of different ones. There's Anchor, Compression, Custodian, Dark Mist, Dark Strider, Havoc, Lull, Mesmer, Nexus, Silhouette, Splinters, Squall, Swarm, and Void Visions. That's all the abilities you get to choose. And when you pick one, you can then upgrade it. So you can get Anchor 1, then you can get Anchor 2. And these are almost all of these, I think all of them, are combat abilities. None of these are abilities that you're expected to cast outside. There are no rituals in this class, right? And yeah, there's some neat ideas, and we get into some of them will be very familiar. You get basic teleportation. You can create weapons out of like aether. You can summon creatures, very similar, just basic ones, swarms. And then there are ciphers. Ciphers are specific magical artifacts tied to each one. So each stranger has their own unique artifact. So that that's why they're here. So each of these names were mentioned earlier in the chapter. And we have some archetypes. Archetypes are, once again, very heavily inspired by like assassins and so forth. The Shadow Walker, the Ghost Hand, Symbiotic Shadow. This is Venom. I'll give you an idea where I can just go off of script and just do my own thing because I'm not beholden to any IP. So yeah, you can literally wrap yourself in shadow that basically creates something that's very similar to Venom. And then there's some fluff rules on how strangers actually work. So that's the Veil system. It's one of the new ones. Like I said, Drakengard, Dishonored, Combat Spellcaster. This is most of these are basically taking a spellcaster and merging it with another traditional martial class. So this one, you almost say, is an arcane trickster, except it's not. It's an arcane assassin, but done in a way that I don't think has ever been done. After this, we move into the trigger system. This was originally part of the Oxomancer, and then I pulled it off completely and created its own thing. This is a magic system. I'm not gonna lie, was a little bit inspired by the movie Wanted, but obviously I added a lot more to it. But the idea of your wand is now a gun, you're now imbuing your bullets with magical abilities. There was a more traditional spellcasting system that was added, but to cast a spell involved you to stop shooting your gun. And I realized that didn't work. So I took that magic system out and I made the Eldritch system, which is the last one in this book. And I created one that was similar to the limit break system in the Martial Artist in Ultramodern 5. So you basically pick, so there are strata and limit break. So basically when you pick this class, you can pick a strata that you want to be specialized into. Chronomancy, cryomancy, so time and cold. We have fire. Sorry, this is sunlight, earth with geo, necromancy, obviously, psychomancy, which is mind shielding, pyro, fire, and then vibromancy, which is thunder. And then as you do that, you can gain additional tier 1, tier 2, and these are the limit breaks. So basically, as you attack someone with a firearm, every time you shoot your gun, you gain a value to your threshold. It's semi-random. And then when you reach a certain threshold, you can then activate the tier, kind of the limit break, right? So here, as an action, release a concussive wave in a 15-foot cone, blah, 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 does a spell-like effect. Eventually, you can get tier 2 unlocked, which requires a bit more threshold, but the power is more intense, more damaging. And you can do more things. For example, We have the limit break power here for pyromancy, scorching ray, but then it turns into rolling inferno, or even explosive fireball if you get to threshold 40. So yeah, and you can actually pick the strata in several different tiers. So because you'll have one stratum here, so you'll only have one stratum and up to 2 tiers in this section, but eventually you can have 5 strata and 7 tiers, which means you'll be maxed out in one and partially up in the other. Now, if this doesn't make a lot of sense, you can sacrifice your strata to get an upgrade in your tier. So this doesn't mean 5 strata, but I can only have 7 tiers. That means by definition, I'll only be tier 1 in like 5 of them, and then tier 2 and 2. No, you could potentially have only 2 strata and be maxed out in both of them. So, but this is the maximum of strata you can get and the maximum tiers you'd get unless you add more by sacrificing strata. And there's also your aspects, which are additional abilities, and you can sacrifice aspects to gain more tiers. Basically, if you pick more aspects, then you gain a lot more traditional combat abilities, non-magical stuff. You just become more of a better gun person. But you can sacrifice your aspects for more magical abilities. So you basically get to choose what you want to do with your class. There's something called engrams, and engrams are inscriptions you put on your guns to make them more powerful. And there's a lot of those. We have some non-magical and magical classes: a cleaner, country gunman, gun dancer, pistolero, and the redeemer. Here are the seals, which allow you to add really bizarre and freakishly unusual magical abilities to your firearms, and there are quite a few. This includes being able to throw your gun, have it come back to you, imbue your bullets with fire or ice or what have you. And there's a bunch of ones that only work with certain weapons. So here, this memento only works with breach and loading firearms. And obviously we have rarities. Some of them are more rare than others. Some of them cost more than others. Because right after this, of course, we have guns. These guns can be used with any of the magic spellcasting systems. It's in this chapter because it's directly connected to this one. I've added the weapon mastery rules from 2024, which you could ignore if you're not using 2024 rules, but there are a lot of guns. Here are just one-handed small arms, two-handed small arms, which extend into here, heavy weapons, and super heavy weapons. You'll notice that you can't get seals on heavy weapons or super heavy. You can only do them on one- and two-handed small arms. The rule is the more advanced the firearm, the fewer inscriptions you can add, which may tell you why you might want to get a dragoon. It's a very, it says a dragon, should be dragoon, because it has 6 inscriptions. Yes, it's a flintlock, so it takes a long time to load. You can only put 1 shot in it, but you can add six inscriptions. Where something like a gyrojet automatic may only have 4. Some of these may actually have even less, like 3. Submachine gun, a more advanced, more modern submachine gun, only uses 3. The ring pistol only does 2, but that's also a size comparison. It's only like this freaking big. So then we have some rules on the weapons. These are illustrations from drawing a blank. Taurus. These are weapons from Taurus. Now you'll think that these are all weapons from Taurus. Obviously, I have added in the weapon mastery. Not all the weapons are here, and I use the illustrations and most of the statistics, but there's some things that are still unique to Taurus. And brings us to Eldritch. Now, what is Eldritch? Eldritch ended up being one of the more complicated ones, just because it's very big. It's like 50, 60 pages on its own. It is a monk spellcaster. The big shtick with this one is that every time you do a cast a spell action, you can do a melee attack along with it. Now, that may seem really powerful because that means you can cast a spell and punch someone at the same time. The balancing or effect to that, if you look at the spells, you'll notice that they often take 3 actions or more, 2 actions, 4 actions to cast, which means you're only casting a spell once every 2 or 3 turns, generally. And so for the rest of the time, you're just punching. So this is a monk spellcaster whose And the thing is, you may think that means, wait a second, how am I casting a spell? And that's where the martial art comes into play. The idea here is that the somatic movements of casting a spell double as martial art maneuvers to punch someone. So you can punch someone, and that actual action can be part of the somatic movements to casting a spell. The idea of taking a martial art and turning it into a spell casting class. And it has 12 different schools you can play with. And as before, they're called currents. So same as before, you're picking the number of currents. You only have one current to choose from, but eventually you can have specialization in 5 currents and up to 10 tiers, even though every tier only has at most 6 tiers. So once again, you can be heavily specialized or branch off and specialize in multiple different currents at the same time. Codice Path is a specific kind of ability. I like doing that, giving people the option of choosing additional abilities. But we have rules on currents. Once again, there are enhanced rules on concentration, because now you have to concentrate on the spell casting. So someone can break your casting of a spell through combat. So yeah, someone can punch you if you're halfway in a 4-cast spell and you're in melee combat. Someone can punch you and break your concentration. Thankfully, maintaining your concentration is a bit easier. And the other thing about this, once again, no spell levels, so you could potentially cast these spells as often as you want. The one balancing act is that almost every spell that lasts more than a turn requires concentration, which means you're always concentrating. You can also bind a spell, which will make it permanent, but usually it actually involves, it almost gives you the same resource strain as being raised from the dead, so you basically are heavily crippled for, in some cases, days. So be very cautious when you want to bind a spell, because it may really affect you for a very long time. There are lots of spells. There are 3 to 4 spells per tier, 6 tiers, and 12 schools. Some of them will be very familiar. Abjuration, we have Aethermancy, which is Aether stuff. Now, people go, well, you were just talking about inspiration. What's the primary inspiration for this one? It's going to seem really obvious once I get to one of the tiers. Alteration, which is shape-changing. This is like morphing stuff. There's some really interesting new morph. You think, oh, it's just a polymorph. There's actually one called like a massive morph, where you're not shape-changing one person. You're merging the mass of 3 or 4 people into one creature, and then you can control that creature. So there's some really messed up spells in the system. Chronomancy, which is all about time. Conjuration is the one that's going to probably reveal where the inspiration is. Eldritch Whips, Tau Mandalas basically allow you to create either like energy whips, energy shields, force blades. Yeah, it's basically Doctor Strange. This is heavily inspired by Doctor Strange. It's called the Eldritch system, and the Eldritch magic is the name of the spellcasting system in Doctor Strange. They never really say that by name in the movies, but I think that's what it's called in the comics. So yeah, this is heavily inspired by Doctor Strange. It's all about creating sigils and using somatic movement. Once again, I've gone off in a different direction. The idea of somatic movements doubling as martial powers for physical combat is something that's kind of my invention. But once again, almost every spell that Doctor Strange has cast in the movies, it shows up in this class in some capacity, including some of the really powerful ones. And usually those ones say you can only cast this as a bound spell, which means you're going to get physically drained for days on a time. Some spells are actually multiple tiers, so you can actually purchase them at 4 and then 5 and 6, and then the damage goes up. You actually have to purchase them in order. This is not like the Chaos system where you're randomizing your spell levels. Once you purchase Explosive Sphere at 4th level, you got to buy the next tier up to get it to 5, and then the next tier after that to get it to 6. Simple as that. Not all of them have them, but a lot of them do. When we get into, let's see here, Wrath of Forgotten, this is the Necromancy. Thaumaturgy is random. It's all about a random chance. There's some rift mechanics in there as well. And then we have Reweave is the closest thing to a wish spell. That's in that same school. Transmutation is turning one thing into another thing. It's different than alteration. This one's all about creating basically stone golem-like creatures and elementals. It's about creating life. This is the similar one to what we did with Sprout, except it's not nearly as complicated. All the monsters are pre-designed, so you can't just create spellcasters on the fly. But there's a lot in here for that. Then we add up with relics. One thing Doctor Strange is really good for is relics. Everything from the sling rings to the cloak. There's tons of magical relics. And so all of them are here. There's actually a few of them. Every school has one. Every school has one for each category: common, uncommon, rare, very rare, and legendary. So these are the 6 for there. 6, so 6 times 12. It's quite a bit. Once again, you will notice some things that are familiar. The Cloak of Flight is a legendary Aethermancy relic. This one should get this one. Kinetic Bracers. Unarmed attacks gain reach. I think you can figure out where that's from. There's definitely some MCU inspiration. And that's it. That's 354 pages. There's the largest freaking index I've ever made. It's like 6 pages. And then our back page. If I was to design another one, if I ran a Kickstarter and we reached a threshold where I said, okay, I will add another spellcasting system, that would be really tough. Thinking about it now, the only one I can think of that I would do is maybe Hextech from Arcane. I don't know how it would work off the top of my head, but that would be something that I would like to play with. Once again, something that's inspired by it, but then I get to take it in my own direction. I'm not interested in doing a 100% perfect, faithful adaptation of a spellcasting system that you saw in some other property, because I would probably break copyright, and I'm not interested in doing that. I'm more interested in taking inspiration and being able to play off of it and create my own ideas from that. It's something I've always been excited about. There's a game called Noita. A friend of mine got me into it, and I played it for a little bit, where everything's based on wands. The trigger system was kind of going in that direction, but then it ran off. But the idea that it's all wand magic, but you can imbue your wand with different abilities, so everyone's wand is a little different. Maybe that would be interesting. I haven't really thought too seriously about it. If you think there's a spellcasting system, and I know whenever I ask this question, I get a lot of people asking for a sphere grid system similar to Final Fantasy or Path of Exile. I've thought about that a lot. My problem, I don't know how to make it within a physical book. The system I did for Maker, where every path has their own tree, was the closest I could get. If I was to do one giant sphere grid, like what we see in Path of Exile or Final Fantasy, where it's 200 or 300 and it's all in one sheet, which means you can branch off into any direction you want. That's incredibly cool. That's incredibly hard. The only way I can think of doing it was to have it as a digital download. Like I would show it as a 2-page spread and say, look, there's no way I can present this in a book. Here is the link to download the 50 megabyte image, and then you can use that to tweak it. And then how do you print it? Does someone put it up as a tile and make it? I'd have to make it as a poster. That's a physical poster that's included in the book. Then you'd have to open it up, and then you could actually create it. And then I don't know. It's something that I would love to do. I just don't know how I could translate it into a physical book someone would have in their hand. As a video, if it's a digital download like this, yeah, it's easy. It would just be a separate image and you can just mess with it. But if we ever go into a physical book, I have to figure out how to make this Path of Exile, Final Fantasy themed colossal 300 sphere grid into something that worked as a physical product. But that's for another conversation. So anyway, these are the magic systems for, I'm going to make a couple changes. Looks like I caught a couple mistakes, but it's pretty big, 360 some pages. It's getting released hopefully this week, as in this, between now, December 2nd and December 7th. Hopefully this week I'll have it out before Christmas. And I hope you guys like it. If you like it, please purchase it. I'm hoping I've presented enough of it so you can see it's a good value. And I hope you'll be excited and help support the company. Anyway, that's been Chris from Deus Ex Machina.